Okay, so we're delighted to welcome Professor Julian Vincent today to give a talk to us at the French Natural History Museum on how to share your problems in an interdisciplinary world using the concept of trade-offs. For those of you that are not yet familiar with Julian's work, a little introduction. He's a biologist who also became a professor of mechanical engineering at Bath University and was also a lecturer at the Royal College of Art and Design and Imperial College London until 2010. He co-founded the Centre of Biomimetics in Reading and Bath and is president of the International Society for Bionic Engineering. He holds an honorary professorship at Heriot-Watt University in Scotland and also at the Hochschule Rhein-Waal, Germany, and is adjunct professor in engineering and materials at Clemson University in the US. He's worked on many interdisciplinary subjects such as mechanical engineering, materials science, architecture, design, creativity, biology, materials, and food. He is and has been a member of numerous scientific and advisory boards, including the Scientific Committee of the CBIOS, which is the French Centre of Expertise on Biomimicry. So without further ado, I give you Julian Vincent. Julian, I'm going to share my screen because we had a few issues with Teams when we did a test yesterday. So I'm going to share my screen with Julian's slides, and Julian's going to talk me through the presentation.
Right, good.
Oh.
Excellent. Okay, ready to go. The trade-off, a universal way to define a problem. And I do mean universal. You find trade-offs not only in biology, but also, and this is the interesting bit from my point of view, you find it also in engineering and technology in general. And the advantage of that is that despite the fact that trade-offs are available, as it were, in biology, there's not very much mathematics being developed which can quantify it or allow you to do what-if types of thinking about it, whereas the engineers have got, and mathematicians have got, quite a few different ways of analysing trade-offs. So I'll talk a little bit about those to start off with. But the main idea is how long trade-offs have been around. Next slide, please. And here I've got a quote from a guy called David Tillman, who is a very eminent ecologist based in the States. And this was something that he wrote in a paper in the year 2000, that the answer to the great diversity of species may lie in quantifying the trade-offs that organisms face, etc. And I actually wrote to him briefly and said recently what I'm trying to do, and he wrote back, he's saying we are of the same mind, and that for the last 500 million years, biology and evolution have been driven by the concept of the trade-off, applications of the ideas. I mean, obviously not objectively, but it's the trade-offs what done it. And so on the next slide, we have a very famous picture. Next slide. We have a very famous illustration from one of Darwin's notebooks. Unfortunately, this particular notebook was stolen from the Cambridge University Library a few years ago and nobody noticed, which is pretty awful. So it's in the open market, and I ask you to keep your eyes open for it. But this is the famous sketch, of course, I wonder. And this is the first time that the idea of evolution and animals and plants all being derived from each other was actually written down. And every single branch point in there, they're major branch points, but every minor branch point, even between subspecies, you can see, you can trace a trade-off having been solved or resolved in some way at each of those points. So trade-offs occur everywhere in biology, and they occur everywhere in technology. In fact, it's a way of expressing a problem, but allowing yourself to come to an answer much more readily. Next slide, please. Here we have a sketch from a book by Mike Ashby, who's an engineer, recently retired from Cambridge. They changed the locks on his door, so he now has to work from home. It's a trade-off showing the modern cars. How much CO2 do they produce, but how much does it cost to own them? And a few years ago, I bought a Ford car, and I especially wanted one with low CO2 emissions, but it cost about twice as much as a normal one. I think it's about £13,000 rather than something like 7,000 or 8,000. So on this trade-off line, I would have been somewhere down towards the bottom right, where it says choice if carbon matters most. On the other hand, if I'd bought a second-hand Ford, which had been around for several years before CO2 was really recognised as something cars could think about, I would be up at the top left there. But you can buy a car anywhere whose performance in terms of CO2 production comes anywhere along that curve. A friend of mine might recommend the one in pink there. I would think that the one in yellow would be better if I want something of average performance. But anywhere along that line, along that dotted line, that what they call the Pareto front, is open for choice for me if my criteria of choice change. Next slide, please. So, in other words, a trade-off allows you to define a problem in such a way that you retain a lot of its flexibility. And this is quite important because at the moment, a lot of evolutionists, geneticists, people like that, tend to think of there being an optimum of some sort. Well, we all know that the environment is changing all the time. This is one of the great things about biology, that animals and plants are very adaptable and they respond to changes in climate and in circumstance. And so in terms of the availability of food. So the trade-off then allows you to define a problem in such a way that you can cope with all this variability. When you read about trade-offs, you can't always decide that you're looking at somebody writing about a trade-off. So the first four examples here, trade-off between accuracy and speed, for instance, that's about the most common of all the trade-offs. Further down the list, you'll see I've got dynamic balance, optimum balance, and there's a negative relationship, for instance, as well. But most of the time, and these sentences happen fairly early on in a paper, you have something or other between one half of the trade-off and the second half of the trade-off. So they can be quite easy to spot. Next slide. I'm going to now give one or two examples of trade-offs and how they have been how they've been analysed, but also to show you that one of the aspects of biology which is particularly useful perhaps in moving from biology over to technology. One of the advantages of using trade-offs isn't just that you can define a trade-off in such a way that it's available to an engineer or technician. In other words, you're translating, at least semantically, the terms which are used to define the trade-off, describe the trade-off in biological terms, but animals and plants have usually solved the trade-off to the best advantage, and they are on that Pareto front. They are on the line which defines the best that can possibly be, considering all the other events which are happening at the same time. This is some work which was done a few years ago looking at plants. And I've chosen some examples where I think it's probably a little bit easier for somebody working in a museum who doesn't necessarily have the wet lab abilities, advantages of a university, where you're rather more interested in development, in comparative morphology and things like that, so that some of these ideas will be able to be applied. And I'm also talking about the way in which these ideas can be moved over into technology. So that is actually quite a lot to get through in the time I have available. So next slide, we've got the technology which is used to make the measurements of plants to be able to try out this trade-off model with plants. And in the left there, you've got a laser scanner, which is scanning the morphology of a plant. You've got the tomato plant, it's a tomato plant in this instance. In the top middle, you have the plant itself. The remaining three sketches, three drawings, are of the laser scan of the plant. And in the bottom right, you've got the plant showing lots of little red spots. Each of those spots is now a data point, and is a data point used to establishing the morphology of the branching which this plant has adopted. Next slide. These points in diagram A, the input points for the tomato plant, have been projected onto a two-dimensional axes. In fact, they're three-dimensional, but there's two, shall we say, limiting ways in which those dots at the top of the distribution can be joined up to the slightly larger dot at the bottom middle of the graph in order to show how they are conducting, or the length of the conducting path through from the leaf to the stem. In B, you've got what's known as the satellite model, where you've just collected each point directly to from the leaf directly to the base of the plant. And so the total distance there that anything has to travel through the conducting system is given you there as length. The travel which they have to go through is also shown there, and you'll see those two numbers are the same, which is what you'd expect with those straight lines. When you come to C, though, you've got what you call what's called the Steiner plot. I don't know why Steiner presumably invented it, and this is been mapped out by a computer, which has taken the shortest total distance which can join all those dots. And so you'll see that it bears very little resemblance to the way the plant morphology works. And you'll notice that the total length of that line is quite a bit shorter than the satellite one. But because there are some points which are now having to go quite a wiggly path through to the base, the total length, the travel length, which is the total of the travel of each of those spots down to the base, all of them added together, that is quite considerably larger. We go through to D, which is what would happen with the plant, and you can see that you've got something in between those. So the total length to be travelled is now in between the satellite and the Steiner models, and so is the travel distance. Sorry, now I can have the figures are a bit small on my screen, sorry, but those are the two numbers to keep in mind, because from the satellite and the Steiner are defining the two ends of the Pareto curve, and the length and travel are defining whereabouts on that Pareto curve a particular plant is going to fall. Next slide, please. And this shows, oh blast, sorry, it's my phone going off. This shows, I'm going to kill it in a moment. It won't die. It's obviously a biological specimen. Here we have in E, F, and G the algorithmic approach to this, where you've got a constant which appears in the mathematical formula which describes the Pareto front. We'll have a look at that in a moment, and shows different theoretical ways or theoretical positions along the Pareto curve, which conforms to something between the Steiner and the satellite model. And then H and I are random connections. And I don't know why I is called the stable one, but that all goes to a single point. So these are different ways in which the points can be connected. Next, please. And here we have the calculated Pareto curve, which is shown with lots of these little grey squares, and the position of the plant, which is a red cross, which has been raised under the particular conditions: ambient shade, high heat, high light, etc. And you see that in each case the plant is conforming with some sort of a maximum performance in terms of the Pareto curve. In other words, it's solved all the problems. There are some other crosses there showing what random architecture does for you, which isn't very much. And also so-called stable architecture, which is that one where there was a whole star of different connections to the top of the stem. So obviously very much the plants are doing very well indeed. Next slide. Next slide. Wake up in the back there.
Yeah, no, it did not come up. Sorry.
No, it's up. It's up now.
Sorry, I think it's a bit of a delay.
Okay. One of the problems is that you can't. Nobody's done any experiments yet to find out how it is that the plant actually manages to get this minimum path length. The only example I've come across of one of these network systems is the insect tracheal system. It is a network. It's got anastomoses in it, and so it's a more complete model of a network than the plant system is. And many years ago, a very famous, almost the inventor of insect physiology, noted in Rhodnius, which was his favorite insect, that if he depleted an area of the tracheal system so the cells weren't getting enough gas exchange, the cells would actually send out little processes which would grab hold of the nearest bit of the tracheal system and pull it towards them. So somewhere in there is a sensory system which says, I'm gasping for breath, I'd better go and get a bit more oxygen. And the cells respond to this and actually pull the redesign in real time the network. But that's what's needed, because, next slide, what we then have is the application of the same set of ideas in a road system. This actually is the road system of in Beijing, where all roads lead to Tiananmen Square. And you have then the roads which have been designed by the road engineers. And on the next slide, we can see what this actually means, because we've got the Pareto front there on the left, which has been designed in exactly the same way, or derived in exactly the same way as for those plants. So you've got the satellite at the bottom right and the Steiner model at the top left. And then in the right-hand one, you've got the road systems of a number of towns: Ithaca, Abbottabad, Beijing, and Rio de Janeiro. And you can see that none of them actually conform with the Pareto optimum. So is there any advantage in trying to find out what the variables are which control access to the Pareto optimum, and see if that can be applied to road systems? This is just one example, and other examples have been brought out, such as organization of shipping routes and things like that. There's a number of organisms which conform to this sort of thing, of course, and the best known is the slime mold, which has been used to redesign the access of motorways within Spain, and things like that. By the way, I hope to be able to send Annabelle a reading list, which will include the references I've used here. Next slide. Recently came to, I was at a meeting where there was some very nice work done on the trapjaw ant. Again, this is something where you're looking at the externals of the animal, and so it's something that you can work out. It's also got some computing, as you'll see in a moment. So there is this quite large group of ants which have got an elastically powered jaw, which moves very, very quickly. Next slide will show this to you. If Annabelle could get it moving, there you are. Yes, and again. Yep. It's swinging around a bit. That's not sort of swinging under gravity. What's happening is that you've got quite a lot of elastic energy stored in the head of the insect, and it's that elastic energy which is being dissipated. So anyway, there you have a jaw which can now trap and quite surprise a collembolid or something like that, which is what it feeds on. Next, please. This is the trade-off. Well, this is the trade-off that these two Chinese people who gave the talk thought were important. Actually, they've got it wrong. The hollow mandible is one of the answers to the trade-off. The two ends of the trade-off are that, on the one hand, they want the mandible to be strong. On the other hand, they need it to be light so that it can be accelerated much more quickly. The problem then is that it needs to have good impact resistance, but being light, one of the ways of doing that is to make it hollow. Next, please. And the way in which they analysed this was to take a number of different models of the mandible and allow it to be hollowed by differing amounts. And they found that 24% hollowing was about the same as what they observed on the insect. Unfortunately, these results haven't been published yet, and so I can't give you very much more detail than that. Next, please. This is the foundation of what was probably the first biomimetic material ever. And it was done by a guy called Jim Gordon and a colleague with whom I worked for quite a long time, Giorgio Ieronimidis. And George was given the remit, what happens in wood, what makes it so tough. He noticed that this S2 wall in the wood fibres, you see this on the right, the S2 wall is about 80% of the total thickness of the cell wall. That cell is probably about 50 micrometers across, and the orientation of the cellulose fibres in the lignin matrix is very close to 15 degrees over most of it. And he said this must be significant. As a word of warning, he went to the botanists and said, well, you know, what about this 15 degrees? And all the botanists could say was, yeah, well, they all do that, without questioning what other possibilities there were, which was a bit depressing. But of course, that made George all the more interested in it, because it's in the nature of things that a good idea is met first with the response, well, that's pretty trivial, really, isn't it? So this was a good start as far as George was concerned. Next, please. He then, and this is a piece of wood which has been broken in tension, and you can see that although a lot of the cells are broken, that there's been an awful lot of damage in between what works out as being in between the cellulose fibers. And so it's the lignin matrix that's breaking down, and that doesn't carry much of a load. But the cellulose fibers, which are the main load bearers, actually are are much less likely to break. This means that this material can accommodate a lot of damage before it finally parts. Next slide, please, which shows a model of this material which George made, and you can see that the fibers have pulled out now from the matrix. So these are glass fibers now wound at 15 degrees, or they were originally, and the section has been, the specimen's been pulled apart on the horizontal axis here. The U-shaped thing at the top was originally just a narrow slit, so you can see by how much the specimen has stretched before it has failed. And in the next slide, we see a force deflection diagram of a single fiber. So this is, when I say fiber, I mean a model of the cell. So it's a tube now with glass glass fibers wound at 15 degrees around a former, and then put into an epoxy matrix. So it's a morphological model, although it's not using the same chemistry, obviously. And the beginning part of the curve shows you a straight line where the model is being stretched, and finally it collapses partially, and so the force then comes down. But it's only the lignin matrix, it's only the epoxy matrix which is broken. The fibers are still to a large extent intact, and so the material goes on stretching bit by bit, and as you can see, each of those little nicks in the curve, it's breaking until finally it breaks totally. And you've got a huge area under the curve, and that area, you've got force times distance, so that area is the amount of work which is required to break the specimen. And each of those little nicks is equivalent to the sound that a piece of wood makes as you break it slowly. So if you get a piece of doweling and then break it between your hands just by bending and listen carefully, you can hear little clicks happening. And so long as you can hear those little clicks happening, which is each of those fractures occurring, you know that the material's safe. It's when it stops making a noise that you know that it's going to break any moment. And so when you use wood pit props in a mine, you need to have the pit props continually talking to you, and then you know you're safe. It's when the pit props suddenly turn silent that you know it's time to run. And the same happens with gliding, apparently, according to Jim, who is a great glider. You hear the wings creaking and groaning, and as long as they go on making that noise, they're fine. But it's when they stop creaking and groaning that it's time to look for a nice flat piece of land, because you might be able to land there safely, otherwise it'll be nose first. Next slide, please. And this is a mechanical test simply to show that the area under that curve in a number of specimens of this material actually shows the greatest, is the greatest when that fiber angle is at 15 degrees. And the next slide compares a number of different materials with what they call a drop weight test. And we've got carbon fiber reinforced plastic solid, oak wood, George's wood made in a different way. I call this George's wood because we never thought of a better name for it. Some tough aluminium, some tough steel, and George's wood made out of the tubes, as I've just shown you. And weight for weight, George's wood can absorb 5 times more energy in fracture than the toughest steel. It's brilliant material. Unfortunately, being new, nobody knows how to use it. It's been around for roughly 40 years now, I think. I've just found somebody who's starting to make materials based on the way insect cuticle is put together, and I've been talking to him, and he's very, very enthusiastic about this material. So possibly we'll have the breakthrough. But there you are. This is one of the problems with biomimetics. Some of the ideas are just too good rather, to be applicable immediately, because mostly people are very, very conservative. It really is rather dreadful. Next, please. And we're all of us trained to be innovative, and not everybody can cope with that. As Annabelle will no doubt tell you. Here's some, this is the result of a standard Friday afternoon experiment where I was interested in the way in which a wood wasp manages to drill a hole. And here you have Megarissa Nortoni, I think it is, and it drills a hole which wanders around through the wood. It can navigate with it, and it's trying to find the larva of a Cyrex wasp or something like that. Next, please. And the wasp has a problem because it's got a very thin ovipositor, but it needs to be able to penetrate wood. And if you use a standard drill, that means you have to press on the drill to get it to go in. But with a very thin drill, it's going to buckle. And so the answer to that from a technological point of view, obviously, is that you make the drill short and fat. But that stands in the way then of the drill going in easily. So it's a standard trade-off. How do you break the trade-off? Well, what the wasp does, as you may well know, is to have the drill in several parts, 3 parts in fact. And on that divided drill, next slide please, the one side is always pulling while the other side is pushing. And the net result of that is that it's the end of the drill, the tip of the drill, which actually pulls through the drill through the wood on the one side, and allows the other side to be able to push with a much higher force than it would be able to otherwise. But it can also navigate as a result of this. And I've got here a film, a video, which is made by a friend of mine who actually turned this into a product.
Okay, I'm going to show the video now.
Good.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great.
No sound. No sound.
Okay, I don't know why there's no sound.
Well, leave it. You've got the footnotes there.
But we've got the subtitles. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. Yeah. Well, this is Ferdinando. Yep, there you are. Rodrigo Cipina. He walks quicker than that usually. Good, thank you.
Great. So now we're going to go back to your
Back to the slides, yeah.
slides. Just give me 1 second.
Well, the next bit is the sort of random route to between me doing some work in New Zealand, which led to the idea of the wood wasp drilling its hole, and Ferdinando, which was a totally random pathway. I'd got no idea of where it was going to lead. And I didn't know that Ferdinando was in the audience when I gave the lecture. And it's, could you put that on full screen, please?
Sorry.
On display.
There we go.
That's better, thanks. And so what we need is a more objective way of doing this. And so the next few slides is a fairly quick trip through. Next one, please, which shows you the information that you might think is going to be help you here. Well, you've got all these different ways of putting information together, but they don't actually tell you very much. Next slide, please. What you really need is what they call an ontology, which is a logical system, quite complex actually, where you're putting knowledge together in a semantic context so that you can actually produce arguments and trails of logical thinking. And in this way, you can actually solve problems. So I've managed to turn, next slide please, I'm using a database of trade-offs taken from biology. I have imported those into an ontology using basically a Russian system, which shows how you can take these trade-offs and integrate them with the solutions to those trade-offs in a biological context. I've managed to work out, again, a semantic way of translating those biological solutions into technical solutions so that this ontology, next slide, please, can translate from, on the left here, trade-offs in biological texts through the ontology, which is in yellow, to what a user of this system would actually see the design problem. He asks the computer, he tells the computer the trade-off. The computer then, the ontology program, shows you the design changes specific for solving that trade-off and suggests design solutions within a technological context. So you've managed to travel from the biological research to the technical research, the technical answers. And I'm going to leave it there with the idea, next slide, that you can think up quite a few things which seem to be impossible. But if, like me, you've been retired, you have sufficient time to think about these things and actually to sort out concepts which the normal workday doesn't allow you to play with. But of course, in the end, everything dies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. That was fantastic. So now, if there are any questions, I'm just going to have a look in the chat. Okay, there are no questions as yet, so feel free either to raise your hand if you have a question for Julian or to put your question in the chat. And I'll start with a question that I have about the wood wasp and bio-inspired applications. You gave a talk a few years ago at the Scientific Committee of CBIOS about the wood wasp and the fact that the same biological model was being explored in an aeronautical context to develop an asteroid drilling machine, but that in fact that project didn't come to fruition because either there wasn't a biologist on the team or the engineers didn't have enough biological knowledge to use the different aspects of the wood wasp's solution in inverted commas, to an engineering system. Could you elucidate a little bit more about that and the role of the biologist?
I'll comment a bit on it. In fact, the wood wasp project, well, we sorted out the basic mechanisms of it in New Zealand. That was then published, but I had a phone call from an Italian group who wanted, who'd been asked by the European Space Agency for a project on biomimetic, which included some biology, and this particular one was how to excavate on an asteroid or something like that to get samples. And so I suggested, well, I'm sure we could turn the wood wasp drill into something like that, because since the drill itself finds its way in there and doesn't need to be pushed externally, or is at least minimal amount of force, that means that it can work on zero gravity, whereas anywhere else you need gravity in order to counteract pushing the drill into whatever it is. And this project then got taken up by some people in the UK who were designing such equipment. And they, after about, I think, one cycle of development, abandoned it and ended up with something more like a mole at the end of a hole with a single shaft connecting to it, which completely threw away all the biology. Now, the difference between them and Ferdinando is that Ferdinando's father was a neurosurgeon. Ferdinando was brought up in at least a medical ambience, and so was familiar with a lot of biological systems, and also presumably had a lot more confidence in the way that biology works. I mean, when I started in an engineering department, one of the lecturers came up and said, well, now of course you're not doing science, you're doing practical stuff where everything has a practical outcome of survivability. And I wasn't quick enough. I should have said, well, bugger me, all animals and plants survive very effectively, and so they're just as practical, if not more so, than the engineering. I don't know what would have happened had there been a biologist on that asteroid drilling project. But I'm sure that they would have been able to use it in other ways. In fact, I had a chat in a car going to a Chinese meeting with, oh, I forget his name now, but he was somebody who was associated with, he was a German. And we decided that the wood wasp system would be very good for going down splits in rocks and things like that. On the moon or on an asteroid, and could still be quite useful in doing microsampling, but it never got that far.
At least it's had a successful application in the medical field. Xin Sheng, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Hi. Good morning, Julian.
Hello.
Nice, because I had some technical problem to connect. So I figured out, you know, for some reason I never had it. When I click the link, it never pop up a Windows. So I've switched to on my mobile phone. Then it gives me the option on my computer that I can transfer on my computer. So there must be some trade-off behind for whatever reasons. Okay, so. Yeah, this may be why I see very few colleagues from museum except Anthony. Maybe they have also this problem, Annabelle. We have to check it. So yeah, very interesting talk, Julian, as usual. Just a question about the George's wood. So this 15-degree fiber orientations. Is this a general feature for all parts of wood? Or it depends on the function? Let's just make me more clear. So I can understand for the trunk part of wood, they need very support all the charges. So we can understand maybe 15-degree is the optimal of the trade-off. But maybe for other parts in plants, they may need flexibility or they may need other things. Do we always observe this 15-degree orientation or it varies?
No, in fact, that orientation is all over the place. I think George was very lucky to find 15 degrees and show that by the mathematics that actually was an optimum. If you look at, I mean, any tree is growing, whereas the xylem vessels, which are the ones which are giving the main support, are not growing anymore. And so they're being stretched as the tree grows older, the ones on the towards the middle of the stem. So their angle changes, and you can, as the tree grows, and they can't do anything about it. So if you take a section through the trunk of a tree, you'll find that there's a gradient in that angle. But all you can say is if the gradient is if it isn't there, if your fibers are going straight up and down those the cells, you're in the worst position. You may be strong, but you won't be able to resist compression very well at all, and you certainly won't be very tough. On the other hand, if you've got something in compression a lot, you want the fibers at a much lower angle, almost horizontal. And if you have a look at an old tree, you'll see that near the base, you've got a sort of wavy curve to it. And those are all compression creases, so that the wood does in fact fail in the end. But by then you've got enough mass there for it to be strong. And this mechanism is not so much for supporting the wood as to making it tough, so that if the wood breaks, or well, if it cracks or anything like that, it'll be able to repair itself. And when we have a gale, if you notice, very, very few trees actually break the trunk. They're nearly always uprooted. So the wood itself is able to take these forces very successfully. Wood actually is by far the most efficient material. The flagpole in Kew Gardens is the tallest thing which can be made out of a single material, and it's made of wood. So architects are rediscovering wood now. I don't know how high a skyscraper they'll be able to build, but certainly in parts of Sweden where wood has been used for a long time, they're using it a lot more for housing, and it's a very efficient material. It is actually better for making aircraft as well than the magnesium alloys which are used. It's better at fireproofing, so it's safer if an engine starts to burn. And of course, because it absorbs so much energy, it's much safer in a crash landing. So we'd be far better off with wooden aircraft. Unfortunately, they've got a bad reputation, and an old biplane, for instance, is usually described as a large number of pieces of wood flying in close formation.
That's really interesting.
Okay.
Yeah. We've got another question from Adrien Sansados from CBIOS. He says, thanks a lot for your talk. He's very interested by the trade-off approach. He wonders, do you systematically see or identify trade-offs when you meet a new biological system in nature or in literature? Or does it need to be clearly stated or characterized by a scientific paper first?
Well, the trade-offs are there. That is certainly. Whether people doing the research actually couch their initial questions in terms of a trade-off is far less likely. And I think this requires a change in mental attitude. It's not always easy to detect a trade-off either. But for a time I was doing a journal club in Oxford with final year undergraduates, and I was giving them papers where I knew there was a trade-off, but it wasn't necessarily explicit. They were then asked to find out what the two halves of the trade-off might be, and to examine the paper as a result and see if they could find out how that trade-off was resolved. And almost universally, they said that this made the paper much more interesting to read. They had to analyze it, but the results of the paper were much clearer. And they also decided that there was an awful lot of the paper which didn't need to be there, which actually rubbish. So that having the trade-off approach is quite a good clarifier. Not only that, but the young lady who was sort of in charge of all this, who was a postdoc and interested in education, said that she thought the students ought really to be given this sort of information in their first year as to how to read a scientific paper, and that if you can find the trade-offs in the paper, that clarifies the whole thing much, much more for you. So it's a good thing to do. not enough people do it, and even fewer people actually, I think only about half the papers which mention trade-off in the various ways actually analyze what the trade-off is, what controls the trade-off. And it's that controlling thing which is the important one, of course. So there's a lot of way to go with this one yet, but it is tremendously important.
Oh, that's interesting. And we've got a question from Nikolai from CBOS. Nikolai, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Julian. It was a fascinating talk.
Thank you.
I work on a search engine, biomimetic search engine here at CBOS. And I've come across a little bit your work, obviously the trees matrix, as well the ontology, the automated extraction of trade-offs from texts. And I think this is something that I saw in your presentation as well. There are two important things. One is how do you identify trade-offs in text? And second, how much abstraction work needs to be done on both the engineering and the biology, and to actually identify the keywords that define the trade-off. So my question is, how much of that work can be automated actually? I mean, what's your feeling, and how much can it actually then needs to be done by a human?
Okay, could we go back to that slide, how to spot a trade-off?
Yeah.
Slide number 5. Because there I've got some examples of what you actually find in a text.
Here we go.
Okay, great stuff. Good, thank you. So often you find that it's simply stated as trade-off between something and something else. A dynamic balance between something and something else, optimum balance, sometimes negative relationship. And a large part of the time, I think sort of 60% of the time, you're going to find something like this early on in the paper. It'll at least say trade-off. And the between and the and are the important words to look for, and you can then see that they signify the two halves of the trade-off. I should add, by the way, that I'm looking at two-dimensional trade-offs here, and you can have any number of factors involved in a trade-off. So you have to be a bit careful. And I think probably one of the skills in biology, when you reckon that more than 85% correlation between the two variables that you're looking at, that the remaining 15% is all the other factors which interfere with the relationship that you're looking at. And so the trick in biology is to find the main trade-off, and that's the one you should be looking at to give you the best experimental results. Anyway, so we can do that, just about. And that's the work which has been done by Ruben Kraufer, and presumably those are the papers you've been looking at. We are at the moment trying to work out how to pick out those two halves of the trade-off. I've done it myself. It can be quite quick. I can look through a paper and maybe in 5 or 10 minutes work out what actually is controlling the trade-off. Other ones it's a bit more difficult, and I find it's quite useful to mark up the paper, just pulling out the various words and tracing them through the paper, so that the two sets of words used in these initial definitions, for instance, can act as signposts towards the end of the paper. And you'll find most of that in the discussion, of course. So I can't go much more than that. At the moment, we are working on it. Work in progress, as they say. If you want to join us, you'd be very, very welcome. And I'm hoping that Professor Tillman, whom I mentioned on the second slide of this talk, I've only recently got into contact with him because I think it's only recently been worth my while, or his while for that matter. He sounds intensely interested. It is a path to quantification, I think, of trade-offs. As far as translating the trade-off into technology, again, that's based on the TRIZ system, and all I've done is try to interpret the technological things into something which is biological. If you're interested, send me an email and I can send you the contents of a workshop which I might be showing, which if COVID and Annabelle allow us to, I could come and work through in the museum sometime next year. I've been developing this as a 2-day thing in China, and so have a selection of papers, a selection of questions to ask, complete tutor notes, all sorts of stuff, and included in that is how to spot a trade-off. I could certainly send you immediately some of that work. The whole file is a bit big, though, as you might imagine.
Yeah, so we've been liaising about this workshop. It would be fantastic to do something like that at the museum next year.
Okay, what's Nikolai saying? Nikolai was saying something as well.
Yeah, I was just saying that would be great. Yeah, I'll find your email through Annabelle later on. I'll send you.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Cheers.
Are there any other questions or comments? Well, if not, then we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much, Julian, for your time and a fascinating talk. You've kindly shared the presentation with me, so if you're okay with that, I can turn it into a PDF and we can allow it to be downloaded by our colleagues if they would like to sort of go through the detail of your presentation again. The recording will be put up online for people to look at, and as you said, you'd be happy for your details to be shared with the participants today, so I can pass on your email address if people have further questions.
Okay, some material of mine is available on ResearchGate, and I also have a couple of sets of project reports, one on this project I've just been talking about, and another one on a project of trying to get some of this stuff into the Design Society. I have yet to write the final chapter of the Design Society one. I don't think they can cope with it.
Well, we look forward to seeing that, and many people have written in the comments. Thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you.
So,
thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Julian.
Bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye,
Bye.
everyone. Thank you for coming. Bye.